Hi, I'm Jacqueline Luqman, and welcome to the Real News Network. Are we getting the real story about Venezuela from corporate media? We're going to talk about this today with our guest, Paul Jay, who is the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network. So in your estimation, I'm leading up to, if Chavez's revolution is a lesson for how we can use electoral politics for revolution, what are the takeaways for us here? Since we have this growing, almost new progressive movement under the Bernie Sanders revolution, right, of 2016, what do we take away from the Bolivarian revolution, the current struggles in Venezuela, and what do we tell people to do with that process?
Well, this also kind of goes back to your first question. The Venezuelan experience is not an experience that teaches the United States can't have socialism. It's ridiculous. The whole point, if you want to understand basic theory of socialism, it's advanced industrialized capitalism where you can have socialism. It's very difficult to have it in countries that don't have an advanced capitalist infrastructure with a modern educated working class and so on. And especially small countries, when you're surrounded by big enemies, it's also very difficult because you can see right now the kind of pressure they can put on a Maduro government. Whatever the faults of the Maduro government, and I personally think there's plenty.
Sure.
That being said, the external pressure that big finance and the Americans can put on, sanctions and so on, it's very hard for a small country to push back. The potential in the United States is completely different. So in some ways, the conditions for socialism in the United States are very good.
Really?
Absolutely. You have a big modern industry, you have big monopolies that have developed wonderful internal rationalization. You have a global supply chain that's brilliantly worked out. They're now using artificial intelligence to organize the supply chain and how they deliver. I mean, imagine Amazon's a miracle to me. You can order something and get something in hours now that's produced who the heck knows where. So the kind of growth of this kind of more internally rationalized enterprises is one of the conditions for a more planned, more collectively owned economy. I mean, the problem of these big enterprises is obvious. They're privately owned.
Right.
So, Jeff Bezos gets super rich. So it doesn't matter how wonderful it is, and they pay crappy wages.
Right. And he doesn't want his employees to unionize, so they have no collective bargaining.
But imagine if Bernie Sanders hasn't even talked about this, so I shouldn't say Bernie Sanders, but imagine if you are able to elect, and maybe this happens at state levels first, where you could start, buy Costco, or just create one. Start controlling through public ownership some critical elements of the economy.
Workers' collectives and
on a bigger scale than workers' collective.
Okay.
Diversified forms of public ownership and workers' collective. But if you're going to break down the power of the oligarchy, you got to start working at a scale that really challenges them, particularly in the banking sector.
Right.
Anyway, that's kind of another conversation from Venezuela. But just to say that, what could be done here? The Venezuelan experience doesn't teach us that much, except in maybe forms of people's democracy, and the fact that a very progressive government came to power there. Now, that being said, we should never underestimate that this is the heart of the empire. What's possible in a small Latin American country, or I'd say even a Bolivia, Brazil was the biggest country to kind of go down that road, but you can see the external pressure the Brazilians were under, in spite of the fact how Lula and the PT, to a large extent, played ball with global finance. Even there, the modest reforms in some way that were being done in Brazil was too much. Soon as there was a weakness in the Lula and the PT, they go for the juggler and get rid of them so they can have a more overt reactionary type of exploitation. What's possible here, who knows? And what I mean by who knows in this, you get these weird moments in history, like even Chavez. And it was a weird moment in history where a charismatic guy shows up. Mm-hmm. The mass movements at a certain level.
Right.
The Venezuelan economy was, in trouble. It wasn't la la land the way the media is talking about. You get these weird convergences of moments, and we may get one. This 2020 election might turn out to be that, because if people start to understand how severe the threat of climate change is, and you can, elect another climate denier or a climate denier enabler,
right,
which is to a large extent what the corporate Dems were, because you pay lip service
right
to the threat of climate, but you don't
say
really do anything about it.
We must do something about climate, but they don't actually do anything about climate.
I went back and looked at Obama's State of the Union's message. I looked at every State of the Union message to look what he said about climate. It was like, at best, a paragraph or two in a grocery list of all kinds of things. And it's usually buried halfway down his grocery list.
Right.
One State of the Union didn't even mention climate.
Wow.
Not like zero. And together with corporate media that barely covers the issue, I mean, these are the people that enable a climate denier to get elected president.
But President Obama signed the Paris Accord. Wasn't that great? Wasn't that progress?
Well, I mean, compared to Trump, maybe. But, a study came out from seven of the leading climate scientists last fall that said if every country that signed the Paris Accord fulfilled all their pledges 100%, we're still going to cross the 2-degree threshold. That's that critical warming threshold by the year 2050.
Wow.
I mean, that Paris Accord was so far from what was needed, and it wasn't obligatory, so it's not so hard to sign.
Right.
So the interesting thing is, and I mentioned this in an earlier interview I did, everyone's talking about socialism now. Trump has to declare that socialism is going to be the great issue of the elections, and these socialists this and these socialists that, and
he
point
mentioned
to
it
Venezuela.
in his State of the Union address.
But he doesn't want to answer the question, why is socialism such an issue? Why are people that say they're socialists getting elected? Because capitalism is out of answers.
Exactly.
It's not the failure of socialism in Venezuela that's the big story.
Right.
It's the failure of capitalism around the world to deal with climate change, to deal with the threat of, accidental nuclear, and maybe deliberate, but accidental nuclear war, to deal with the threat of financial meltdown, which is surely coming sooner or later.
Yes.
To deal with the consequences of what AI is going to mean in terms of people's employment and how the economy is going to look with artificial intelligence.
Yes.
To deal with the existing chronic poverty in cities across the country. We're in Baltimore here, and this is decades and decades of deep chronic poverty and a murder rate of 350 or more a year.
Yes, and
more than New York.
Yes.
It's because the system is out of answers that so many people are talking about socialism. So it's not because it's somehow Venezuelan experience is going to show, don't go there. Also, it's not going to work, because they can yell about this, but people are going to understand that what's going on in Venezuela is a specific thing for Venezuela. Maybe it has more broad application for Latin America.
Right.
But this has nothing to do with what's going on here.
So the takeaway from this is that the corporate media's drumbeat of Maduro is evil and socialism is evil and socialism is why all of these countries in Latin America are failing might actually have the absolute opposite effect, at least for people in the United States who are facing some of the same economic pressures, the same failures of capitalism that people in Venezuela have faced.
Well, the problem is corporate media has such a big platform, and they keep repeating this crap, that we're pretty small And there's the other voices that are trying to talk realistically about Venezuela are also relatively small. And corporate media just bans the voice. Like, I mean, no one's calling me from corporate media to talk, or most of the guests that we have on who really know Venezuela never show up on corporate media, or almost never. So the problem is that people don't know the history, and the bigger problem is people don't know their own history.
Exactly.
You know, there's been such a demolishment of the public education system in this country, especially on the issue of the teaching of history.
Yes.
And corporate media has really degenerated. It was never so great to begin with,
Yeah.
but it's been a great degeneration, especially since 9/11.
Yeah.
And so it will have an effect. But I think the policies that Bernie Sanders and some of the other people, all the progressive women that have been elected to Congress and people that are running, those policies, in fact, are resonating. And I don't think this Venezuela thing, if you look at polling numbers on what people think of health, Medicare for all, and some of these other reforms, minimum wage and so on, the polling numbers are actually quite high in favor of these policies. So the gambit about Venezuela, they'll yell about, but I don't think people take it that seriously. But it's very interesting that in the year 2020, we're coming down to socialism versus capitalism as the election issue. I mean, we can have another conversation with just what does socialism even mean?
Sure.
Because most of these reforms, like I say, are actually pretty modest in the scheme of things.
Yes.
But in the end, I think this is, in the United States, it's going to end up, and listen, you can see from the polling numbers, an increasing number of people think, hey, socialism isn't such a bad alternative.
So if the situation in Venezuela is not entirely about the failure of socialism, then what do you say about the economic situation that really does exist, that is really a crisis in Venezuela? There are food shortages. People are having shortages of medicine. Doctors are now protesting in the streets, claiming that they want aid to be brought into the country. People are saying Maduro is not allowing aid into the country. If this is not a failure of socialism, why are people hungry in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, it is a failure of the kinds of policies that were developed over the years in the attempt to build socialism. There's certainly failures there, and to say otherwise is just naive and covering up the internal issues.
Okay.
And as I said earlier in the interview, there was no game plan here of how to develop socialism. The Bolivarian Revolution and this new government that came into being came into a system rife with corruption, as is true in most oil states. Mm-hmm. Corruption and big oil kind of go hand in hand. It's hard to imagine much big oil without reams of corruption, especially countries that are very dependent on oil. So it wasn't like corruption entered the scene. And I personally, I think perhaps they should have been better at fighting corruption during the Chavez years. But it's a delicate balance, trying to have reforms and fight against corruption, particularly in the armed forces. It took time to get the armed forces kind of on board with the Bolivarian process earlier in the days, even though Chavez was popular. A lot of the armed forces, the leadership was there from the previous governments. So this relationship of fighting corruption and taking on sections of the elites, it's not a simple thing, and it's easy to, again, sit here and pontificate. But there's no questions there were failures. Does this prove the failure of socialism? I mean, it's ridiculous because it's one country's experience. Some of the similar policies are being developed in Bolivia. It has its problems, but it's not suffering in the same kind of way. The manipulation, I think, to a large extent, of the price of oil had a lot to do with the problems in Venezuela. On the other hand, there was probably time to have a more diversified economy and not be so susceptible to a drop in the price of oil. And there's people better than I am to really detail how some of the economic policy, exchange rate policy, some of these things could have been different.
Sure, sure.
So sure, in the end, the internal issue is critical, and yeah, I mean, look at the situation. There is a failure there. That being said, one, it doesn't prove anything about socialism in other countries and what's possible and what isn't. And two, as I said earlier, a small country trying to defy global capital and under such pressure and such attack, how do you judge the internal policies when there's such external pressure on it? But yeah, there's certainly failures there. But so what? The Venezuelan people will sort out, and they'll figure out if there isn't this external interference trying to overthrow this process. But part of the process of having this kind of transformational revolution is you got to know your enemies. I mean,
Sure,
clearly,
yes.
I mean, they have a coup in 2002, which the Americans helped to orchestrate. And it was the people's will that brought Chavez back. Massive demonstrations against the coup, and they were about to execute Chavez. And the soldiers refused to fire. And people's, and there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands were surrounded the palace demanding Chavez come back to power. I mean, that's an expression of democracy. That's in some ways a real expression of democracy.
That's certainly the narrative and the history that we also don't hear, that we don't see in this country in regard to Venezuela or any other country that we have targeted for regime change for our own capitalistic elite purposes.
I mean, if the Americans are so concerned about the Venezuelans and they're so concerned democracy, then stay the hell out, stop the sanctions, and give the Venezuelans a chance to sort this out. But clearly that's not the U.S. agenda. Caring about the Venezuelans is the last thing on the minds of people making American policy.
And we thank you very much, Paul J., for coming on to talk to us about this today. I am Jacqueline Luqman of the Real News Network.